essentially argued with its main dogma that illness is merely an illusion of the mind, and if one were to alleviate one's symptoms and the disease itself, one needs to foster a disbelief in the disease, advocate for prayer, and occasionally take homeopathic remedies with no medicine whatsoever. The aforementioned group of visiting ladies that had visited Eliza were actually a group of Christian scientists from the Church of Science in Boston that had come to visit her for a couple of days. Now, and let me find my spot. I apologize. Another interesting anecdote about Eliza is her purported engagement to none other than Ensign Worth Bagley. He was the first officer to be killed during the Spanish-American War. He was killed aboard the USS Winslow at the Second Battle of Cardenal off the coast of Cuba on May 11, 1898. Now, this was especially striking to me as the Bagleys were of a prominent family lineage, especially Worth Bagley himself. Most notably, his half-brother, Josephus Daniels, ran the prominent Raleigh-based News and Observer newspaper, and his maternal grandfather happened to be Jonathan Worth, a former governor of North Carolina after the Civil War. I could think of no way possible for the Pottses to have met with the Bagleys until I stumbled upon a possible connection. Apparently, as we had mentioned before, Samuel Potts, or Eliza rather, Eliza's father, Samuel Potts, was, of course, as previously mentioned, close friends with Henry Bascom Short, whose mother's name was Marietta Bagley Short. As her maiden name is Bagley, that obviously places her somewhere in the Bagley family lineage, so perhaps there is some connection between herself and Worth Bagley, but that remains uncertain, other than the mere hearsay that she was, engaged or betrothed to Ensign Worth Bagley, and this controversial photograph which we have here. Here we can see Eliza relaxing in a hammock, but on the right-hand side we have her brother Junius, and in the middle there's a lot of controversy that surrounds this figure. There's some who argue that it is in fact Worth Bagley, and there are others who argue no, it is simply her older or her younger brother Samuel Chatham Potts Jr. Now, personally, I believe this gentleman's facial features to be unlike her brother Junior's, because he has these very prominent, chubby cheeks, and he has a taller brow and a much more slender face. But as to whether or not it's Worth Bagley or not remains uncertain. Further information would be needed, and further evidence would be needed to be compiled in order to corroborate such a claim. Moving on further, we have Samuel Chatham Potts Jr. himself, who unfortunately there's not many details about his life. He attended a couple of dances at the Lumina Dancing Pavilion at Wrightsville Beach near Wilmington as a stag. He enjoyed competitive bowling nonetheless. He received an education as an engineer, and he shipped down to Panama in the December of 1905 to assist in the Panama Canal's construction. He ended up contracting tuberculosis, however, so they sent him up to a sanatorium in New York, where he happened to meet a young woman by the name of Ethel, who was also being treated for tuberculosis. They got acquainted with one another, got to know one another, and after they both were cured of the disease and dismissed from the institution, they married one another in September of 1912. He moved back down to the Panama Canal with his wife, as a matter of fact, and he stayed there until its completion in 1914. As of the census of 1920, he's documented as residing in the riverside town of Chester, Connecticut. I have no idea how he got there or why he decided to go to Connecticut in particular. But he co-founded the Middlesex Handle Company Incorporated, where he made, for a living, axe handles of all things. He lived there for the rest of his life until 1939, where he died at the age of 56. And likewise, there are a few details about Junius's life, however, unfortunately. Other than that, he was a gracious host at Camp Easy Life here on Lake Waccamaw. He shared his brother's affinity for competitive bowling, and he was trained in business at Cape Fear Academy, and he ended up taking the position, as previously mentioned here, at the railroad depot as a clerk. That is, until he ended up going down to Panama with his brother in 1910 to help him with some clerical duties. He ended up moving back to the States in 1912 aboard the SS Atenas, which is a Spanish transliteration for Athens. He ended up going back to North Carolina, and he married Miss Mary Powell of Fair Bluff, and he settled there with his children, and he lived out the rest of his life as a jeweler until he died in the December of 1935 at the age of 48. I'm afraid that missed to go through all of these slides. I apologize. I mean, there's actually the SS Atenas, as a matter of fact. Right there, I was able to find that photograph of it. Nevertheless, he decided to move to Fairbluff, and that's where he died. And one of the notable descendants of Junius Smith Potts is the actress Annie Potts, who had the role as Mary Jo Shively in Designing Women, which was a television series that aired from the late 80s and into the early 90s. She happened to be the Ghostbusters secretary in the first two movies, and this kind of bespeaks my millennial heart. She was the voice of Bo Peep during the Toy Story movies, nonetheless. Now, I'm afraid that we might have gone over on time, so I'm afraid that I won't be able to get into my historical appeal for, why history is important. Just take me at my word, or feel free to ask me. We'll begin our 15-minute question and answer session. Or you can clap one. I think I like that. Thank you very much. It's very kind of you all. Thank you. All right, would there be any questions? Let me get my timer set up. Answer session now. Have at it. Locked and loaded. Question?
Are there any letters at all from anybody
From Samuel Potts.
about he's the subject of a letter, or he's the writer, or letters to him?
The only thing that we have in our archives here, and unfortunately a lot of Potts descendants moved away, as I had previously mentioned. Some went to Connecticut, and they followed, of course, well, they were born there. Their father, Samuel Chatham Potts, Jr. Some of them went to Bowling Green, Kentucky. Some were as far down south as Florida. There's one gentleman who's in South Carolina, and he actually took some of our documents and photographs, original documents of Samuel Potts. I've been trying to get back up with him for years. And I called him while I was doing my research, and suspiciously, his number's been disconnected. Unfortunately, the only thing that I know that we have here at the Depot Museum is that postcard that I had mentioned that was addressed to Francis Beers Galt, and a couple of letters from Atlantic Coast Lines and telegrams instructing him on his duties. That's about it, unfortunately. Yes, ma'am?
What's been the biggest surprise to you in doing this research?
Oh, mercy me, that's a good question. That's a really good question. Oh. What's the biggest surprise about Samuel Potts? I suppose I would say the biggest surprise about Samuel Potts is the fact that he, he lives up to his name as, a mysterious and enigmatic figure, for better or for worse, for lack of historical documentation, or the fact that he, kind of cultivated this cult of personality, if you will, about himself, as if he were some mystery. And I suppose, seeing the authenticity of that is what struck me the most. Thank you for asking. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, concerning the question of whether or not he was a telegrapher for Robert E. Lee.
Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence that he served in the Confederate Army?
Is there any evidence? See, that's the question. The only thing that I've been able to find is those two entries for a Mr. Potts. I haven't been able to find anything for a Samuel Potts, Samuel Chatham Potts, Sam Potts, S.C. Potts. That's the only thing that I could find. And the official records would be the place to look, because as extensive as it is, 128 volumes, by no means is it exhausted, but that would be the place to look. And if there would have been any documentation of Samuel Potts, it would have been in the official records, so far as I'm concerned. Yes, sir?
I was the one that built the model of the...
Mr. Earl Hubbard.
I talked to you on the telephone.
Yes, sir. Pleasure to meet you in person.
There was no question in my mind about there was two Bohemian girls.
Mm-hmm.
So to get those photographs and check them very carefully,
Yeah.
you'll find a decided difference.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit in the length and the set of poles for the roof and everything.
Yes, sir.
And a different engine too.
Yeah.
But there was three actual steamboats. There was a steam launch too.
Okay.
There's one picture of it. But it's got a steam engine in it.
Okay.
It's got an internal combustion engine.
Mhm.
I thought they would probably use that to tow stuff across, but I'm glad that you brought up the fact that the Bohemian girl could do the same thing.
Yes, sir.
And make a few bucks that way too.
Yeah. Thank you for that contribution.
Glad to help.
Yeah, that was Mr. Earl Hubbard, everyone. He put together a replica of the Bohemian Girl, which we have in the back. Feel free to browse it. And that actually leads me in a little bit of a segue, if you allow me. In that Wilmington Messenger article that I cited, it refers to a steam yacht as the mascot, and that's the only entry of some other steam yacht or steamship that I'm aware of that Sam Potts operated other than the Bohemian Girl. So thank you for that. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Relative Sam Potts billed himself the Bohemian Girl?
Earl Hubbard, you'd be more qualified to answer that than I would. You have no idea?
I honestly don't know.
Undoubtedly,
The only pictures you see of him is standing next to it and everything.
there is a couple of pictures, and unfortunately I don't have them here with me on my PowerPoint presentation. But there are a couple of pictures of Sam Potts standing next to a boat that is in fact in construction, or is at least having some modifications done to it. He probably could have financed it. He was by no means a rich man. That status belongs to the Shorts, the Beers, and the Galtzes. Henry Bascom Short, his obituary covered an entire page. And that was just the first paragraph that I shared with you all. I shared you the entirety of Samuel Potts' obituary, and it only amounted to 2 paragraphs. So he was a man of means, but was by no means necessarily rich. I believe he could have financed the construction of the boat. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I want to hitchhike on Earl Hubbard. I'm so glad you're here.
I am too.
I got your number out to call you today to tell you about this, and I thought, oh, man, well, he's not gonna come, but look, while you're looking at his Bohemian Girl, go toward the front window, and there's a shadow box in there that he has built that I show people every time I come in here. He is one of the reasons that the museum is here because of the contributions that he has made, and Earl, thanks for being here today.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any further questions?
One thing I found out about
Yes, sir.
the celebrities,
Okay.
they were hired employees because they were, technical people.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't necessarily offices and things like this, and maybe General Lee or somebody would hire them to later.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I did find that much out,
Okay.
for sure.
Thank you for that, sir. Any other questions? Believe you had one, ma'am? Yes, ma'am?
I just have a comment.
Okay.
If I may be able to add to this, when Matt Thompson did his presentation, he not only alluded to, he gave factual information that there were 3 Bohemian Girls.
Okay.
They were different sizes, different shapes, and they were used for different things, thus being why the size and the shapes.
Okay.
And he went into more detail, I'll be honest, than I remember, but he did say that there were 3, and that was the first of my knowledge. I've been to White Cuban Museum lots of times, but I had never heard that there were 3. He may have. I'd like to know if he knew about that.
Mm-hmm. Any comments, Earl Hubbard?
I don't know of anything except the 2 new Bohemian Girls that were part of it. The other thing was a launch, but it was a steam launch, but had no cover or anything on it, just an open launch for towing stuff or, whatever they had to do.
There's a lot of uncertainty in the subject, but thank you for making that contribution. Thank you, ma'am. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Why did you choose the subject to explore?
That's a good question. I suppose my introduction, going to the late time antiques and whatnot, and that kind of serendipitous encounter with the photograph struck an interest with me, having brought it with me to college, and occasionally looking at it. And then lo and behold, I come here and begin my internship. There's an entire exhibit dedicated to the man. I suppose that's what really spurred my interest. But I suppose, considering that there was so much mystery, as we had mentioned before, surrounding this man, I suppose this gave me the opportunity, whether I realized it or not, for this to be my first historical foray, if you will. I did my first extensive research on the subject, over 20 pages, which I know it's not that much, but as much as it is for me. So it kind of gave me this opportunity that I was glad to take up, and I just kind of ran with it. Thank you, sir. Is the highway named after Sam Potts? As a matter of fact, it is. But I'm neglected to get into that. I'm sure that would have been an interesting topic of conversation. When exactly was the highway formed? Who decided to name it after Sam Potts, and for what purposes, perhaps? I haven't looked into that, unfortunately. But thank you for that question. It is, in fact, named for Sam Potts, everybody. So remember that when you're driving up and down the road. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you know where his residence was in the lake?
As a matter of fact, we do. If you will meet up with me after the presentation, I'll be able to show you the map back there, and I'll try to describe to the best of my ability. His, and that map actually was compiled by a gentleman that I mentioned throughout my presentation, Charles Beers Galt, who spoke with Mrs. Betty Timberlake, and we got a lot of information from him, thankfully, about the early time period here at the lake. But his residence would have been past the road, so far as I know, and a little bit to the right, kind of in that plaza, if you will. Once we get back over there, you'll be able to see where it is positioned on the map. I'm afraid that I can't describe in much detail. I'm not a cartographer of sorts. Any other questions? Have an awkward silence.
Thank you.
All right.
I tell you what, that was a special treat. Y'all have no idea what it's like working and having him up here. This is phenomenal. And after just 2 days, he came in with 10 pages of size 12 font with all the information he had gathered in 2 days. So I can't wait to see what he's going to share with us at the very end. We have refreshments. I thank you all for coming. Please take the chance to speak with Joseph, and I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.